1, 2, 3, 4? Right, thanks. We'll talk about oxidation of contacts later. I have no particular plan, no particular subject. I made a whole bunch of notes because if I don't make notes, I tend to just ramble endlessly. But I usually default to rambling endlessly. So what I'd like to do is talk about whatever you're interested in. It's a pleasure to be here. I have fond memories of this town. Contrary to what it says in my bio, I dropped out of MIT. I didn't graduate MIT. And in fact, I dropped out of courses at Harvard and at Caltech. So I decided to have a well-rounded education, dropping out of some of the finer schools that I could find. But what I want to talk to you about today, I mean, the talk, Leaders, Followers, and Machines, not my title, but it's as good a title as any because it gives me something to think about. And I guess I'm a little concerned that there is so much focus in companies, this nation, and our universities today on getting the correct answers that we are seldom taking time to be thoughtful about the questions. And so I think what I want to think about is a little with you today is what's it take to ask the correct questions? You know, what is that process? How do you know it? Because getting a brilliant answer to the wrong question is seldom useful. And I think you're seeing good examples of that in the press almost every day of the week. And so what's that about? When you start thinking about leadership, what will leadership mean? There are a whole lot of enterprises in government, intelligence and such, which are talking about, I mean, the terms you hear now are transformation, horizontal integration. Basically, it's all saying, we built a machine to do the Cold War. Who knew? The Cold War ended, and now all of a sudden we're trying to repurpose that machine to do something else. Really hard to do. Machines don't repurpose well, whether they're human-populated machines or other types of machines. And so I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to talk about implications of technology. Technology is impacting our lives for better or worse, whether we like it or not. And so the question is, given that kind of environment, what can we do to optimize that in some way that it might, in fact, be more effective than it would be if you simply stood back and watched what happens? How do you make those calls? Some number of you in this room are going to be put in a position where you're going to be making calls on whether to adopt a technology, pick from one of 7, ignore it, do something else. How do you make that decision? How do you make the decision of focusing the attention, betting the farm on one particular technological track when you don't have any good information that would enable you to make an intelligent decision? And those are the kind of decisions that you're going to have to make from now on in the future constantly. And it's a set of decisions we as society have to make. Meaning, you know, we were talking about this at lunch. I would argue that within the next 50 to 100 years, death is going to be optional. You know, you get to decide. The society has to decide. Death, you want to die, you want not to die. What are the implications of that? How do you do something about that? When implants become commonplace as intelligence amplifiers of people, when basically, you know, right now, kids terrorize their parents by getting pierced and tattooed. You know, it's the current thing. I mean, you know, when I was a kid, we terrorized them by other means. Your kids or your kids' kids are going to terrorize their parents by going out and getting a net job, you know, basically getting wired. And this is not optional. This is going to happen, period. It's just a matter of time. All the technology foundations are there for it. It's going to happen. So the question is, do we let it happen? Do we have a choice? Is it good? Is it bad? And what can we think about policy-wise now that might affect the trajectory of those kinds of inevitabilities? And one of the issues is, how do you determine what is inevitable? Because inevitability is kind of an interesting concept, where I have watched in my lifetime multiple technologies which people said couldn't work, wouldn't work, such as massively parallel computing architectures, where you basically take tens or hundreds or thousands or millions of little microprocessors and you get them all to work together as if they were one computer. And there are a whole set of laws and arguments about how this will not scale above a certain number of processors. The processing overhead to get them to work together is greater than the gain you get from the processors. Turns out it was a wonderful argument. scholars and mentors of mine like Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert wrote a paper, Perceptrons, which explained why neural nets don't work, et cetera, et cetera. The only problem is it's all wrong. And when you have a very persuasive argument from very bright people that's wrong, it often sets back a field by 10 years or so because none of the grad students will work in it because they will not graduate if they work in it. And it turns out to be a field that they can't make progress in. And so a lot of these phenomena drive things in a way that's not obvious. So I'd like to talk about those kind of things, but I'd really like to talk about whatever you're interested in talking about. I'd like to stop for one moment, and can we just hear from a few people in the room, because it helps me to talk to you if I know what you're interested in and what your backgrounds are. So at random, would you please holler out who you are and what the hell you're doing here?
I teach communications here, and one of the things I do is storytelling.
Oh, that old thing. I'm fond of referring to it as the world's oldest profession, contrary to popular rumor. Someone else. You.
I'm Suzanne Goldstein. I had the good fortune of being Bran about 11 years ago. One of the stories you told back then, this was at a conference, was that the internet was the greatest invention since fire. And I'm curious how you feel about that 10 years later. I'm here at the Hitachi School, the mid-career program, having been in technology for the past few years, seeing what happens in terms of private collaboration.
I'm Greg, and I would love to know your ideas on globalization and leadership and diplomacy.
It's a fad. No, I was kidding.
I'm Rebecca McKinnon. I'm a fellow at the Shorenstein Center, and I'm very interested in part of my project here is looking at how technology and the internet transform journalism. How we
Already has.
transform journalism in ways.
That it hasn't happened yet, but the other part's happening. Mm-hmm.
I'm Brad Swing, and I'm interested in high-performance green building technology.
I don't have gain control, but if you'd like, I can stuff a Kleenex over the microphone. Perfect, thank you. Sam, say it again.
I'm interested in high-performance green building technology, whether we can build buildings that power themselves just by their relationship to Earth.
They can, but they have to suck it from somewhere. So the question is, where do you get enough?
I actually graduated.
Shocking.
My master's. I would like to build a bad.
Yes. Personal computers would be high on my list, but I can get into that later. Anyone else? Anyone else is not represented by this community that just spoke up? Okay. In that case, what I'd like to do also is talk about your big six. The six things based upon what I'm hearing that you absolutely, positively have to get right in your life and careers, or you're going to fail and you may screw up the planet. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This concept of leadership is a really interesting one because as you sort of careen forward in your career, you start realizing that there is a real challenge of how you get big organizations to function effectively. Little organizations can be as much of a challenge, but big organizations in particular, it's very challenging due to the inertia and scale. And when you're talking about things having to do with public policy, when you're talking about things having to do with defense, you're talking about building codes and institutions and getting people to think green, you're talking about these kinds of interactions, planning, how does it work? You have to get big organizations to change, or basically nothing will happen. And big organizations are intrinsically change resistant. They exist like any other organism because they have a very strong survival instinct, and survival is generally interpreted as don't change anything because this worked and got us here, so therefore let's keep that there. There's an antibody reaction you trigger when you start doing change in organizations. Very effective, tends to kill the change quickly and effectively, or at least isolate it so it can't harm the larger organism. And what do you do about that? More importantly, how do you pick and identify the leaders of tomorrow who are going to be capable of executing these things, creating these visions? And all of you are here for one reason or another because you're candidates for that. You know, you're a self-selected community. You wouldn't be in this room if someone didn't think somewhere that you had the ability to lead, to theorize about leadership, to have impact on the world at large. And many organizations, I mean, in the defense community, a few of the folks that I work with, and I work pretty evenly with folks in government industry, non-government industry, creative industries and such. They've got a really interesting set of challenges, which are lack of flexibility in hiring and firing procedures, which are just set up institutionally. A lot of people who have nothing much to do other than make your life miserable, or that's the perception of leadership, generally speaking. They would often perceive otherwise, but how many of you are in that position and have experienced that phenomena? Trust me, if you work in government, you will decide that is quite correct. University systems are like that too, incidentally, some. You find yourself in a situation where the question of selecting, how do you pick someone early in their career, nurture them, get them to the stage so they're prepared to be the next leader. If you get this wrong, for instance, if the Army gets this wrong, we could lose the next war, or we could start the next war, or we could do some combination of things that could be catastrophic by any number of metrics to the course of our nation. And it was very interesting because on one level, you're talking about something that's a pretty qualitative set of things, meaning, you know, the soft and fuzzies of who's going to make a good leader. At the same time, you're dealing with organizations like the Army, which are very highly quantitative. The Army is big on metrics. If it is measurable, they will measure it and write it down in your file. And it doesn't matter if it's your dimensions, it doesn't matter if it's your attitude, it doesn't matter how well you did in an exercise, it doesn't matter if it's a passing comment that happened at some point in your career. It's recorded and used to maintain the cut of your jib from the perspective of your promotional path through the organization. And the same process happens to a less formalistic extent at most enterprises. I mean, the Army cares about your inseam. Disney didn't care as much about your inseam, but cared about, are you likely to make the company successful? Are you likely to be able to do the sorts of things necessary to keep the stock price up or move forward in a way that will advance the brand? The Army did a study a number of years ago on how do we find our leaders, where do we get them. One of the good news about being part of a study with an organization like the Army is if you think history is valuable, meaning you want to go back and see that, an organization that writes everything down and doesn't throw it away is kind of useful because you can look at the history. Those Army people, am I speaking truth here? Yes, okay. So they decided to use the scenario planning process. Everyone familiar with scenario planning as a technique? Fine. Anyone who isn't, when I ask something like that, don't be shy to say something, because if most people nod their head yes, I'm not going to explain it. So scenario planning largely says, let me explain it, basically says that what you're doing is effectively picking a couple of axes that you think are fundamental to the success of the organization, such as if you're looking at a product, will it succeed? Cost of goods versus sales volume, et cetera. Doesn't matter what it is. Different industries pick different things for leadership, for where's their company going. But the purpose of it is to imagine the scenarios of things skew on these axes. And it's represented as, 4 quads. And the idea is basically, if let's say, cost of goods higher, cost of goods lower, volume higher, volume lower, it gets you to think about the what ifs. And the assumption is always that where you think you are or where you think you're going is there. So the starting point is, this is what we believe to be reality at the moment. And the exercise I find is actually often a very useful one, because what it does is get you to think about possible futures that don't tend to come up in the normal conversation of the enterprise. And the Army, this was fashionable about 10 years ago, thought this would be an interesting exercise to go through. And I spoke to some people who were in the study, but don't ask me to cite the study because I don't remember and neither did they. This comes up every so often. But it was basically, where do the leaders come from? Where did the next generation of leadership come from? From the Army. And they decided, and the art in scenario planning is deciding what the axes are, because it's not self-evident often what the axes are. And the two that they settled on, that they thought were important, were intelligence, because they test that and they measure that, versus motivation. Because motivation is a big thing in the Army. You're going to take the hill, you're not going to take the hill initiative. So they basically, created a sort of continuum where over here we had the smartest people. And over here we had the least smart people, capital letter D. And over here we had the most motivated people, capital letter M. And here the laziest people, capital letter L. I don't think they use these words, but take it from me, this is what they were thinking of. And in any organization, there's some distribution of people from dumbest and smartest. In this room, for example, one of you is the smartest and one of you is the dumbest. You may or may not know who you are, but face it, by some system you choose to measure it, you're there. And then whether it's a bell curve or some funny shaped lump, in self-selected organizations like the Army, the distributions can be very atypical. For example, number of people who are colorblind in the Army. Answer is 0, because you can't get into the Army if you're colorblind. Why? Because it was probably determined it's easier than doing maps and displays that can be read by colorblind people to just not have colorblind people. So the 11% of the population that are colorblind, if they're severely colorblind, they don't get into the Army. And so you'll often find that the self-selection process skews you one direction or another, but they looked at the distribution. And again, motivation, your service record tells you a lot about motivation. Now, you could quibble about if it's real motivation. Doesn't matter. It's the Army's definition of motivation, just as the Army's definition of intelligence based upon their standardized testing and such. So again, we're talking about a self-selected community looking at itself that believes in itself that its metrics are correct. That was the assumption going into it. Now, what's interesting about this is when you have, dumb and smart, lazy and all that, it doesn't take a lot of intuitive smarts to figure out that if you went here and you picked the dumbest, laziest person in the Army, that they're probably not going to be the next 4-star. That they're probably not going to be the one that's going to rise above all of the others. So some results you get like this are not particularly surprising. Just as in a study of sales and marketing, if your cost of goods is way up and your sales volume is way down, it's bad. Could be worse if your sales volume is way up, but you're losing money on every product. People have experienced that as well. And so, this was not surprising. Now, one of the things which was actually kind of interesting is that when you look at the whole curve and you sort of pick a distribution, you say, well, I've got dumb, I've got motivated, I've got smart and motivated. The Army believed that where it was going to find their best people is here. And it wasn't the case. Why? Smart, motivated people are a big pain in the ass. Simple as that. They're annoying. Nothing's ever good enough for them. They wake up in the morning, terrorize everybody. People don't like to work for them because they're smarter than everybody, and they often are, incidentally. This is not a perception. They're that. But again, how many of you worked for really smart, motivated people? Annoying, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those things where it can be great things, but it really wears you out. More importantly, it wears organizations out, especially big ones, because they are not capable of matching the rhythm and the pace of that sort of leader, which means that sort of leader tends not to be that effective. They may be brilliantly good at getting one thing done, and whether it's a Hyman Rickover in the Navy getting nuclear power to happen, or it may be a bunch of other things, but they seldom have broad effect over the larger organization. There are notable exceptions, but rarely. It was interesting to note that when you look at this whole dumb, lazy thing, you'd think, well, that's bad, we don't want those. Turns out what's worse is to have dumb, motivated people. I will leave it to your imagination to determine why that might be. But you want to cause a lot of damage in an organization quickly, put someone stupid and really energetic in charge, and what you'll find is an affair. How many of you experienced that? Yes, I knew we hit the sweet spot of the room. The interesting result, which I think surprised everybody, is here's where the great leaders came from. Somewhere in here. Smart, lazy people. Why? Smart is self-evident. Lazy because they build strong organizations because they certainly don't want to do all that work themselves. They're very interested in elegant process which is self-correcting and servos around the right solution. So that ultimately they can be at the golf course and check in every so often, and the fact that they go away, the organization will not only continue but will elevate in its performance even without them being there. And that tends to build long-term, very effective organizations that can perpetuate themselves. The problem is, knowing this, what do you do with it? Do you hire just smart, lazy people? I mean, you do that, nobody shows up for a war. You know, they're all at the golf course, you know, sort of wanting someone to tell them how it's going and so forth, and that's not terribly effective. So you find when you study this stuff that often information about who made the great leader isn't necessarily helpful in what you do next or how you morph your organization to make it more likely that these folks pop out. Now, you can also argue they picked the wrong metrics. Well, you can always argue that. And the problem with doing things that are highly qualitative when you try to make it metric-based is you're always going to be guilty of some set of egregious errors based upon things that you locked in that shouldn't have been locked in because they're there, or things that you just completely missed the point of. You find that when you talk to people at a war college. I can't think of a speech that I've heard by a senior military leader where the art of warfare isn't discussed with equal reverence as the science of warfare, meaning the sense that there's something that is not quantitative that you can't press your finger on and such. Politicians, clearly, the question of where are you going and how, the political sensitivity of the decision, how you tell the story, where you go. And understand with disclaimer, storytelling is a passion of mine. I believe it's the core competency of education. It's the core competency of the entertainment industry. I believe it's the core competency of politics. I believe it's the core competency. I mean, again, education. Think about the people who really motivated you all. It wasn't someone who necessarily knew the subject the best. It was the person who could capture your imagination and inspire you to say, I want to be like that, or I want to be one of those. Storytelling is core to an enormously broad spectrum of skills. Interestingly enough, seldom acknowledged as such, unless you're in something like the entertainment business or an industry where it's not considered soft and fuzzy is not considered bad, but considered something you get paid more for. When you start talking about art, in the military, you only hear it by the 3 and 4 stars because no one else is brave enough to use words like that. Because the sense is, what do you mean, this is art? It's not art, it's science. So, again, what do you do? How do you identify this? How do you take the skills of storytelling, which what do leaders do with it? They use it to inspire people. They use it to motivate people. They use it to take a vision which they may or may not have developed themselves and articulate it within their organization to outside organizations to gain support so that their organization flourishes. And this doesn't matter if it's a company, it doesn't matter if it's a university, it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, why is Harvard successful? Well, endowment is useful. And it's by having the right people, motivating them, having an alumni association, having a board that goes out and twists people's arms, so you build an institution, something that will outlive its founders and the other people beyond them. Don't do a good job of storytelling, that will not happen. Followers, second word. Why do people follow things? Sometimes fashion. Fashion is a strong motivator. Doesn't matter whether it's in clothing, doesn't matter whether it's in politics, doesn't matter whether it's in military. In the military, the fashion of the moment, as I said earlier, is transformation, horizontal integration, and capabilities. If you had to pick the 3 fashionable words these days, it's that. Capabilities, and again, for those of you who aren't around military speak a lot, capabilities as an antidote to the process of requirements, which was sort of a rigid method of how you drive new things by having what's known as validated requirements, which means a whole bunch of people say, yes, we really need this stuff. This is not a military-only thing. It happens, it's all over the place. Transformation, acknowledging that there needs to be a continuous process of reinvention to keep enterprises capable of responding to the new world. And the new world could be threats, and the threats could be unconventional enemies, Al-Qaeda. It could be conventional enemies that are changing their form, or it could be potential enemies, or it could be the Hill, meaning people are ready to cut your funding, which means your organism is under threat, so what are you going to do to preserve its existence? But I have found that in self-selected communities, and all of the ones we're talking about, whether it's political communities, whether it's corporate leadership, whether it's military leadership, are all self-selected communities for the same reason you were selected to be here by some set of criteria. And the criteria might have even been you walked in off the street because you saw a poster and it was cold outside, and, you know, that's self-selection. I mean, it may be different than some of the other people in the room, but hey, you know, free food, that usually at a school is a strong motivator for anyone. But I guess what I'd like to talk about is within self-selected communities, how in my experience, there are basically two kinds of people, and they think about the world differently. And probably at the highest level, the two kinds of people are people who believe that there are two kinds of people in the world and people who don't. You know, the sort of people who decide the world is black and white and you can simply divide it that way, or no, it's a continuous shade of gray, or what do you mean gray? It's purple, it's magenta, it's taupe, it's etc. The fact is, people do sort into categories, and the two type that I've experienced the most in leadership-oriented communities, the first one I would call a requirements person. Why am I talking about a person? Because last time I checked, communities and organizations are built out of people. And so looking at the individual element, the quanta of an organization, a person, people tend to self-select to people who they like and think the way they do. These are the people who get promoted. These are the people who feel comfortable. These are the people who want to stay. So communities tend to be self-selected. The MIT community is a kind of person. The Harvard community is a kind of person. Doesn't mean they can't interoperate, doesn't mean they do other things, but there are distinctions and generalities that you can put. Now, a student at Harvard and a student at MIT, they're both probably reasonably bright because they got there, so there's one set of hurdles they passed over. They may or may not be motivated to think or care about much of anything. I mean, the spectrum that I saw, people who knew from the moment they were born they wanted to be a physicist, and other people who don't have a clue as to what they want to do and are kind of parked in the architecture program thinking about philosophy and maybe it should be cooking. But they don't offer that here, so I'm going to stay in the architecture. So, you know you're in trouble when you meet someone at MIT whose major is humanities. Then you know that anyway, this person is confused. Or their parents made them do it. That's another one that happens. But requirements people, let me take you through the process that they use in inventing a new product, coming up with a new policy, doing anything that requires the introduction of something fundamentally new. And whether it's the introduction to the world or introduction to themselves, I find the process is often largely the same. The first thing they do in requirements organizations is they put together a team. Big emphasis on the word teams. Next thing they do is empower the team. Never figured out what the hell that means, but the team needs to be empowered to do something. Usually I find if you just ask them to do something that would work, but no, they have to be empowered first, so we empower them. The next thing they're expected to do is go use due diligence. See what's best in class. Look at what other teams who've been empowered to do this before in our organization came up with. Look what other people think is a clever and interesting way. What are the innovative things? What are the disruptive technologies? Go read Clay Christensen's book. You know, a whole bunch of things which is sort of laying pipe to be ready to do something real in this. Critical thing is go talk to the customer. Enormous emphasis on customer focus, meaning we can't live in this insular world anymore where we just dictate, we have to go talk to the customer. Generally speaking, this follows a series of discussions of metrics. It's believed in requirements organizations. If you can't measure it, you can't manage against it, and you can't evaluate it. So we're all going to agree, as an empowered team, what our metrics are going to be of success, and so forth. Being a diligent, faithful, and loyal requirements team, we're going to put together a preliminary requirements document intended to inform senior management of where we're heading with all of this. It's always a document. The sense is if you don't write it down, it isn't real. So you can have all the talks you want, but if you don't put it into, some form of a deck, it doesn't mean anything. Emphasis on deck. I mean, I drew this for you rather than using PowerPoint for two reasons. One, PowerPoint is evil. And in fact, if you want to increase the efficiency and capabilities and resourcefulness of any organization, ban PowerPoint, and you'll go a long way because you'll actually increase people's ability to tell stories to each other and communicate real information rather than eyewash. It's also massively parallel, random access, editable, dynamically reconfigurable, much better than any of this other stuff. And the preliminary requirements document basically says, we've got a guess of where we're going. We, as a responsible team, want to freeze requirements early. You get very high points for freezing requirements early and preventing what's known as requirements creep, meaning make up your mind so that it can go on to the other people who can cost it, manufacture, and do it, so you get high points for freezing requirements early. It's submitted to senior management, it's reviewed, and it is rejected. Why? It's going to take too long and it's going to cost too much. This happens on every preliminary requirement document. This triggers panic in the team. who basically says, oh my God, I thought we were doing exactly what we should have. We researched this. This is exactly what the market says we should do. The customer loves it. Everything's great. You go back to the customer. You do a thing called value engineering. Value engineering is a buzzword for telling the customer they can't have what they want and what can you live with. So you go through this process of what can you live with. All of that goes nicely. You iterate back and forth. You spiral. You do research and development. You do a whole bunch of other things. Slowly, interest for the project starts waning. And each requirement document that's being submitted, it used to be they would get rejected. Now we don't even hear anything, meaning it just sort of goes into the void. People leave the team. People are reassigned. When the last one or two people are ready to throw themselves from the tallest property owned by the organization to which they are attached, all of a sudden something miraculous happens. It's approved. Now, why is it approved? And why by this process? Because in requirements organizations, no one has the ability to approve anything, but anyone can kill it. So that if the head of the organization, the president, the chairman says, I want to do this, it's an imperative, we must, doesn't mean diddly. It means that you launch yourself in a process where the rest of the organization will explain why they're wrong and didn't mean that. And with any luck, they'll just wait them out, they'll leave, and this thing too will pass, and the organization will get back to its normal mode. But what sometimes happens is the thing is submitted, nobody objects. I mean, again, if the receptionist in the front hall looks at you funny, can set you back 3 months. I mean, it doesn't, any low-level person in the organization can wave a red flag and say, wait a minute, don't want to do that. Gets approved because everybody who disagreed left, died, or forgot. And all of a sudden the thing accidentally moved off of one desk onto another one. The wind blew, it traveled down the hall and another one, it finally gets approved. This launches a process where the person who picks it up at the other end, now seeing an approval stamp on it, tosses it over the transom to some other group that, contrary to this concept of an IPT, never heard of this thing, don't agree with it, but they're going to go build it anyway. They build it, fix it and improve it, because, again, once it's given to them in perfect form, their job is to improve it, at which point it is tossed over another transom to a user or someone who markets it or sells it. One of two things happens. Either it's a huge success, in which case everybody basks in the reflected glory of a well-executed requirements process, or it tanks, which triggers yet another process, which is called lessons learned, or sometimes learnings, otherwise known as the search for the guilty party. Find out who made this happen, kill them, make sure they're put in a box so that they can never do this again. Does this sound familiar to any of you as a process? Well, there's another process run by a different person that has nothing to do with this process. Different type of person builds a different type of organization. And I would call this a big idea person. Now, I'm drawing a contrast not to indicate that one is better than another, but just that they're fundamentally different. And let me quickly take you through the difference. In a big idea organization, there's no belief in teams. There are superstars and assistants. So that basically you hire someone because they've had a track record of succeeding at doing this in the past, such as a successful director, etc. You put them in charge, a turnaround expert to a company, you put them in charge. They have a bunch of staff and assistants, and it is implicit in this relationship that the key decisions are being made by the person who's leading the team, who has 100% responsibility for it, not the team. And the team is generally happy with this. They don't feel competitive, but just as, you know, this director of photography or the grip or the writer don't feel they need to be the director of a movie. Their job is to make the director's vision happen. And whether they agree with it or not, they do it professionally and interchangeably. So if a DP died, you could have another one take over the next day. The look of the film might change a bit, but it's going to keep going because the jobs are known and understood. And the sense is you're there to make the director's vision happen. And sometimes the director is there to make the story come to life based upon the writer, sometimes their own personal vision. Hard to know what. Due diligence, the last thing you would ever do is talk to a customer. Because talking to a customer will only contaminate your thinking because they have blinders on. They don't know what's new. They don't know what's revolutionary. That's why you got me. I'm smart. I can do that. I'm talented. If we ask them, it'll just drag us down to the lowest common denominator, and that's a huge waste of time. This idea of doing focus groups and other things, so the focus group agrees with your conclusion. They're an incredibly valuable tool. If not, they're dismissed as being irrelevant, and they don't really understand the true vision behind what we're trying to do. Freezing the requirements, they believe in the opposite. Freezing the requirements would be abrogating their duty as a professional creative. What they would be doing instead is messing with it every time they see it. So that I ask you for something, you bring back exactly what I asked for, I say, no, that's all wrong, make it blue. You make it blue, someone else brings it to me, and I said, what did you make it blue for? You know, you asked to make it blue. I never asked to make it blue. Make it green. But it was green. I don't care. Make it green again, et cetera, et cetera. And this goes on and on. Literally, after the product is shipping, it's, don't you think we can recut the film a little? Can't we change the color of it? Software. When have you ever seen software shipped that operates properly? So this idea of continuous improvement as an alternative to requirements, and not that that's bad behavior, but that is the only appropriate behavior, is every time you see it, you're supposed to get inspired and come up with a new creative vision. Now keep in mind, creativity in many organizations is a highly undesirable phenomenon. I mean, we talk about we have to get creativity. Trust me, in a lot of organizations, you don't want creativity. An example I used earlier today is, let's say you make penicillin. Do you want creativity on the production line? I mean, do you want the people making the penicillin? Ooh, we can make it a little bigger, give them more value for their money. Gee, if we took this molecule and stuck it over here, we could come up with pink penicillin. That would be a whole new thing. You don't want that. Why? You want every little tablet of penicillin to be exactly the same as the one that was approved with the FDA, which is what it looks like in the picture in the bottle, and so forth. So this notion that creativity is an essential part of enterprises is nonsense. It's critical in certain parts, but it's by no means essential in large enterprises to the functioning of the larger organization. Doesn't mean there can't be creativity in how to optimize around some local minimum or maximum, but that's not creativity in the sense that I'm using the word creativity, which is give me something fundamentally new and different that changes the way we think about things. The entertainment business, the film business, is a big idea business. It's one where basically, let's say you tried to use a requirements process to make a movie. Let's put a team together, have them go talk to the customer. Ask them what kind of movies they'd like to see. Well, typically if you ask a moviegoer what kind of movie, you get action, adventure, we like that, you know, you're saying fine. You do your due diligence and decide what are the 5 highest grossing films. That would be a good thing to know if you're in the movie business. You'd probably come to the conclusion over the past decade that the essential components are a dinosaur, Leonardo DiCaprio, and a boat. These were probably least common denominators of things that, if you looked at by far the highest grossing films, they had those components as part of them. And so you would submit this as a preliminary film requirements document. It would be rejected by senior management. We can't afford it. Get rid of something. Fine. We'll get rid of the dinosaur. We'll get DiCaprio on the boat. We'll use the dinosaur some other time. Go back to the audience, find out what kind of movie they want. If you ask an audience that, and people do that, they will say, don't ask us, you're the creatives, but we really do like surprise endings. You'll always hear that. Surprise endings are a big thing. How many of you like surprise endings? Yeah, see? You're the problem. Anyway, so we asked some subset of you, and you said, don't ask us surprise endings. Well, you certainly wouldn't do Titanic. You know the ending. The boat sinks. I mean, what's the surprise in that? The fact is, the reason a movie like Titanic gets made is a maniac, like my friend Jim Cameron, is passionate about torturing everybody until his movie gets made exactly the way he wants it made. And I remember Hollywood was talking about this travesty. I mean, the studio, I think, admitted to $200 million as the cost for doing it. How can you do that? People starving all over the world. You could build an office building for that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it turned out to be the most successful movie of all time in terms of box office gross. And then all of a sudden, everyone's lining up to buy the Titanic team jackets because they were all part of the process of greenlighting the project and moving it forward. The fact is, this process of big ideas is not just part of the quote-unquote creative businesses like the entertainment industry. In the military, we were talking to a bunch of Army folks. There was a General Sullivan who came up with an idea called Own the Night. Simple, elegant idea. I want to be able to fight as well in the nighttime as I can in the daytime. Totally revolutionized the effectiveness of the armed forces. All of the services got on board. It drove the development of GPS, night vision, types of radar, types of surveillance systems, all things designed so that you could operate as well in the nighttime as in the daytime. The Bill of Rights was a big idea. A few hundred years ago, a bunch of guys sat down, came up with a set of ideas that are basically the clock running this country and working as well now as they did 200 years ago. Some would argue, I would argue, better. And just look at the rest of the laws that were done 200 years ago and see how many of them are ludicrous at this point. I mean, they're kept on the books because they're so amusing that, you know, again, anytime the word donkey is used in a law, you have an idea that it may not be relevant to the 21st century. But the fact is, the law books are filled with these. And so the question becomes, how do you do something that is such a big idea that it survives, that it can take on a life of its own, that it has the ability to move you forward so that your thinking goes from a simple idea to a bigger idea to a bigger idea to a bigger idea. And that's what the big idea process is about, and there are lots of them. And they're all around us. The internet, big idea. A university, big idea. I mean, big ideas are not rare. We shouldn't look at them like, oh my God, they come once every 500 years. Well, really big ideas come once every 500 years, but there are a lot of big ideas around. How do you get this to happen? How do you get big ideas to happen, especially if you're in a requirements organization? Because the fact is, the vast majority of organizations are requirements organizations. It's most of the Fortune 100 companies, most of the armed forces, most politically driven organizations are not big idea organizations, they're requirement organizations. Most governments, municipal government, big idea is not part of their normal process. Well, the immediate reaction is fine, let's just get some of each. We'll get some big idea people, some requirements people, we'll put them together, slide pizzas under the door, don't let them come out until brilliance emerges. Well, the problem with this is they hate each other. Suffice to say that, well, requirements people think big idea people are arrogant, dress funny, are rude, have no respect for the values of the organization that made us great and got us here in the first place, are disloyal, don't understand what it's all about, et cetera, and are generally disruptive to the well-organized functioning of our enterprise, widely held, and shouldn't be tolerated. Suffice to say that big idea people think requirements people drain the life force out of the room by merely being present. They don't have to say a word, they don't have to even look at you, but their showing up precludes the possibility of a creative idea ever happening. Kind of a wet rag on creativity. And this is an interesting problem, and it's a further interesting problem because a really cautionary note for requirements organizations to remember is there has never been a big idea that has emerged from a requirements process, ever. Why? Because requirements processes don't yield big ideas. Just not the process. It's like saying a work of art has never emerged from a cement mixer. Well, if you say that, no big surprise. But you say, well, a big idea has never emerged from requirements process. Why would it? Think about the process. Think about how it works. Think about the checks and balances. Think about the effects of metrics. Think about all that stuff. It precludes the possibility of a big idea emerging. Now, one of you maybe prove me wrong, but I know of no example of a big idea that's ever emerged from a requirements process. So what do? They hate each other. We don't get it the other way. You have to remember that core competency is something which keeps changing. Just as at Disney, the core competency of the company was becoming more and more technologically oriented, which is when I was running the research program there, we built a fellows program to bring in people like Alan Kay and Danny Hillis and Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert to help make the company smarter on what would be the future of where the entertainment industry is, based on a certain bet I was making about the internet. And, given this, the new core competency of trying to get companies and enterprises to be more creative and to get these things functioning, I think, is realizing that true diversity is the most essential component you can have functioning within your enterprise. Now, whether that diversity means tolerance for different ways of thinking, based upon realizing that in the end the organization will be more successful and in fact its survival may depend upon it, whether it's cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, age diversity, gender diversity, doesn't matter. But diversity, which is exactly what large, well-organized organizations do worst. Why? Because they self-select. And you self-select people that look like you do, think like you do, and work like you do. Not because you're a racist, not because you're trying to self-select, but because you have to decide. And you decide around your comfort zone. Because generally speaking, when people have tried deciding not around their comfort zone, they made mistakes. And in any institution, any organizations, you do not get the behavior you ask for, you get the behavior you reward. And generally speaking, we don't reward people for screwing up. So that on one level we'll say, we want you to be innovative, we want you to think out of the box. We hear that. Requirements organizations, you hear think out of the box. Big idea organizations haven't got the faintest idea of what you're talking about. What box? Never occurred to them there was one, didn't think they're in it, and so forth. Requirements organization, you get them to buy into thinking out of the box, the first thing they start doing is designing a new box to climb into. So, out of one box into the other, maybe into a bag. This kind of thing. That's innovative. We're getting out of the box and into the bag. So, again, I believe that this notion of diversity is absolutely essential. Consensus management and consensus thinking is the most evil and destructive process at work for innovation that I am aware of. It should be discouraged at all costs. There should be constructive tension. There should be a realization that there are a bunch of people that you need to succeed that you're not going to understand and you might not even like. They feel the same about you, but you all agree that ultimately this is an essential combination to succeed. And if you can build that notion of constructive tension and diverse talent within an organization, I think you have the ability to succeed. Because ultimately, I think the only organizations capable of succeeding over the next century are going to be those that are capable of doing big idea thinking to generate vision, and then using a requirements process for large organizations to execute that vision and make it work. And I think that that combination is not only unbeatable, but I think it's the actual only viable combination that will work. It is non-trivial to get that to happen. The companies that are starting to get it right, I think, are benefiting from the reaction. Machines. What is that? What are machines? Let's not talk about machines because that's less interesting than technology. And I define technology as the byproduct of human imagination, meaning it's the stuff you come up with that nobody thought of before that might do something. And these days, who would argue that a software isn't a machine? In fact, the most complex machines being built at the moment, if you define it as maximum number of moving parts, are a software code, which are why they're the most unreliable, incidentally, and unpredictable and hardest to predict the outcome of, successful outcome of. My job was to think about that for Disney. One of my jobs, I was in charge of a group called Creative Technology, where our job and our mission, and within Imagineering, which for those of you who are not familiar, 4,000 people do the science, technology, and creative design for the Walt Disney Company. One customer, the Walt Disney Company, 4,000 people when I got there. It's less now, I don't know the exact number. But whether it's the theme parks, or whether it's the high-definition technology for the network, or whether it's tools for animation, doesn't matter. Imagineering was tasked to supply those services to everybody. Architects, engineers, writers, designers, a whole big mix. But a lot of my job was predicting the future. I was the guy that Michael would talk to because, very bright guy, and yet no technology background. And I was the guy who bridges between the two worlds. Because growing up in the creative community and design community, always comfortable with that, speak that language, at the same time being pretty good at science and dropping out of some great science and engineering schools, I was as close as he had to someone who understood both worlds in a way that they could be made explainable. And I was the closest the company had to someone who could go out and talk to the head of some technology company and talk about why we might want to do something together and what the implications and what would the process be. So that was our job in creative technology. And I got there in 1985. I was there because they bought a little company I owned, and I went along with the office furniture, basically. And when I took over this job of, creative technology, how do we do this? My first big assignment, which was self-assigned incidentally because nobody else thought it was important enough to pay attention to, was what about this internet thing? Is this going to be interesting or relevant to Disney and to the entertainment business? 1985, this was not clear. It was not widely held. The World Wide Web didn't exist. And, internet was thought of as being email, basically. That was the definition of internet, or an interoperability network for universities. The ARPANET, when I was first at MIT in 1970, that's where it was starting, the nodes communicating, packet switch networks, et cetera, et cetera. Various rumors. Some people say, well, it was designed because we needed survivable communications for nuclear command and control. It was actually designed because a bunch of smart people decided this is a better way to design a network and make it fault tolerant and create a lot of really inspirational concepts which we're just beginning to see the wisdom in their vision. One of them being the opposite to the trend today, which is legislating great universal ways of doing things, and instead legislating only the very lowest level things necessary to ensure interoperability. And that's what made the whole thing take off, because it made it very easy to make differing systems be compatible and be able to interoperate. So the question was, what do I advise Michael Eisner and the board on in terms of this internet thing? Do we take it seriously? Do we start thinking about it? Do we start dealing with it? Or do we just wait and see? And tech industries like entertainment are very different than other industries. For instance, people would routinely come to Disney and offer us large sums of money to back one distribution platform. Remember, anytime something like a Laserdisc comes out or DVD, there are always multiple formats. Disney, which had an oftentimes dominant share in home video because of all the kids' movies, would basically be in the catbird seat for negotiating a deal, such that if all the Disney product launched only on one medium, it gave a huge advantage that companies were offering staggering amounts of money for to back a platform. Disney would never do that, the wisdom being, we want the lowest impedance, the easiest path to get into people's lives. And so backing one format, might as well back as many as there are, let them all fight it out, because they're going to buy the Disney stuff anyway, and if they end up buying some piece of junk that discontinued in 3 years, they'll probably buy it in a new format, which means we'll get twice the sales for it rather than, 1 or 2. So it's a different way of thinking than saying, well, we can be part of a partnership to drive a new technology. The only technology Disney's interested in driving is storytelling, which is the core business of the company. So anything that permits that to happen is, generally speaking, the most effective. So the question is, internet, do you back it or not in 1985, based upon what's new? It was nothing new to me. I had an internet account since I had an ARPA account way back when. But starting to think about, well, what could this mean? And keep in mind, we didn't have multimedia computers. We didn't have... the Walkman was considered fairly advanced technology at that time in terms of portability. Nothing was networked. The ideas of information technology was called MIS, Management Information Systems, and it was just big companies on mainframes is the way the thing was thought about. Mini computers were starting to happen, but just as a lot of senior management now is waiting for this whole computer thing to blow over, a lot of people then were waiting for the whole computer thing to blow over. And, they thought, well, we basically need this just to run the books on or do something else. The idea that it would be outreach to customers and consumers wasn't on anyone's radar screen. Words like e-commerce didn't exist, etc. So, how do you decide? And I was thinking about this, sitting on an airplane, sort of looking down at the runway. It was hot, the plane was delayed. We were sitting out there, and I noticed, after getting on the trip, flying another plane, you keep thinking about things. And at one point, I was looking down and sort of seeing, looked like ants, moving around at that height. They were ants. We were on the ground. We hadn't taken off. And I was saying, how can ants survive on a jet runway? But anyway, I digress. The point is, tools that are used to predict technology are traditionally things like Moore's Law. And to misquote Gordon Moore, who was really talking about transistor densities, these days we interpret Moore's Law as being computational power. It doesn't really scale directly, but assume that that's the case, that every 18 months the cost drops in half for a constant amount of computing, or for a constant amount of dollars, the amount of computation goes up. It's worked pretty well for about 25 years. Every year people have argued it'll only work for another 3 or 4 years, and it'll probably work for another 25 years, because as we reinterpret it, there's more to it than transistor density, like compression efficiency and algorithmic efficiency and scalable architectures, a whole bunch of other things. Moore's Law is a good rule of thumb. If you want to know, in 10 years, how much computing power at a given dollar will be available in a device you can build, use Moore's Law. You won't go wrong. There's a thing I call Ferren's Law, because I haven't figured out who else to name it after, which basically says people don't follow Moore's Law. And when you start looking at technologies that are going to have impact, you don't care about Moore's Law. You care about who cares. You care about what is this going to do to impact people's lives. And I think it's interesting to note that in the United States, if you look back at the utopic vision for society 100 years ago, for my role in society, because again, who cares? How does this matter to me? The idea was a little house in the country, white picket fence, a lawn, a cow, so on and so forth, a nice life. You don't have to fight a war, you don't have to be in the big city, you don't have to do a bunch of other things. You have a nice life, your family, you can grow up with whatever values you decide are important for your kids and give them their best start in the world. We went through 100 years of dystopic predictions of the future. 1984, Brave New World, Blade Runner, Clockwork Orange. You know, the literature in cinema is full of examples that basically say, if you think it's bad now, the future is really going to suck. And interesting, Y2K, year 2K. Remember, the whole world's going to blow up on Y2K. Anthrax, doesn't matter what it is, every day there's going to be some new thing about saying life as we know it is over. We went through 100 years, and interestingly enough, the perfect vision for a lot of you in this room is a little house in the country, white picket fence, a lawn, and an internet terminal, so you can complete your course curriculum, you can do your job, don't have to fight in the traffic and do all of that. And I guarantee you 100 years from now, it's going to be a little house in the country, a white picket fence, and an implant, and you'll just be wired directly. Implants are those inevitable technologies. No discussion, it's going to happen. Intelligence amplifiers, just as a computer, a web-based computer is an intelligence amplifier now. You call me up on the phone, I have a terminal up next to me, you're asking me a question. As you're asking me, I'm typing with one hand, looking at it, jogging my memory, seeing things I've never seen. If I do it well and thump for enough, you'll think I'm smarter than I am. I need a joke, I need something. Very, very handy thing. Wired, even better. Always know how to spell, always have the joke you need when you do it, never get lost, always know where your kids are, a whole bunch of things. Whole bunch of other things you have to, what do you bet on? Now, depending upon what you do for a living, betting wrong means you're out of business or you're going to be in the plumbing and heating supply business because your enterprise will fail hard in a way that you may not recover from, or you may spend your life working on the wrong thing, which can be a little annoying. At the same time, there are no absolutes about any of these things. Now, you look at a series of curves, and in every boardroom you see these curves, in every school you see these curves. I mean, my favorite one is this one, where basically it's always presented as this, horizontal axis and a vertical axis. And interesting that these things are always in B school presented as two axes. Why? Because nobody can draw terribly well in business school. So as a result, any n-dimensional problem is reduced to 2 dimensions and then through PowerPoint expressed in 3 dimensions. So the 2-dimensional, you always have time, which is over here, and you always have something else, which is over here. And you're supposed to matter more about it the higher it gets over here. And you look at it, and a chart like this is drawn. Kind of interesting, and the sense is that it goes off the scale nearer than you might have think. And again, the calibrations are not important. This could be number of users on the internet, it could be amount of bandwidth used, it could be number of people not watching television, it could be number of terrorists operating with non-traditional communications means, you name it, it's this curve. And no one can figure out, is it exponential, logarithmic, or geometric? You forget what all those are once you get into management, but you remember that it's getting big, and that's something you have to pay attention to. And then the presenter presents another graph that looks like this. And again, it doesn't really matter what that is, but it's usually your ability to react and what your entire career and life depends upon. So it can be profitability, it can be success, it could be people, watching your television network versus something else, it can be your ability to find the enemy, it can be that kind of thing. At which point the presenter says, and we are here. Now, for some reason, this doesn't look like good news. And it doesn't really matter what, has any of you seen charts like this? Does this look familiar? I mean, I call it the trouble in River City chart. Trouble, trouble, trouble. You get this whole idea that this is a problem. Now, at which point, someone usually gets up, usually one of the gray-haired gentlemen or women in the room, and says, you're an alarmist, we're actually over here. And people don't seem to breathe a big sigh of relief. But at the same time, the sense is we can worry about this next board meeting, not right now. And then usually some young wise ass recently hired in the organization and who got into this meeting by some process no one's familiar with says, no, we're actually over here. It's already happened, and we're such dinosaurs, and we're so asleep at the switch that we didn't realize it. And until it's fundamentally catastrophic, we're not going to know it. The interesting thing is that when it comes to something like the computer revolution, because that's where I first started seeing this chart, was the computer revolution, is what's this going to do? How are computers going to affect our lives? And keep in mind, computers as we have them today are still primitive junk. I mean, we're like 5 minutes into the computer revolution here. It's like, you know, you were told to get an appreciation for the size and scope of the ocean, and you're sitting on the shore watching the waves breaking. It's dramatic, it's pretty, seagulls, makes a nice postcard, but doesn't give you a big sense of what the ocean is. That's where we are relative to the computer revolution. To quote Alan Kay, the computer revolution hasn't begun yet. And it hasn't. We're barely seeing the slightest little ripples of what the implications of this stuff is, especially if you redefine the computer revolution as meaning the implication of networked information devices that are distributed, wireless, connected to people, and interoperable. So, given that, what do you do about it? And what do you do about it when your job at Disney is to make the decisions and the recommendations of what do you do about that, and realizing that if you guess late in most of these businesses, you're doomed. Because coming up to speed after the fact is really, really hard to do. And in fact, sometimes unrecoverably hard to do. So, I went through a process that started on that airplane, realizing that I had to get up and not look at this from ant elevation, but at 50,000 feet. And realizing also that if I believed in Ferren's law, which is that the things that appeal to us, motivate us, and basically give us comfort, love, companionship, food, shelter, you know, go down the list of things that we think are important, literature, music, doesn't matter, go to any dimension you want, but the things we embrace are largely constant and don't change. Meaning, hasn't changed a lot. Our concept of love is pretty much the same now as the beginning of recorded writing. Moore's law is doing this. Human perception of sensibilities and importance of things to impact our life is largely constant. Wavers up and down a little, changes in constant, but largely constant. If you do that and you sort of think about things, I started on an exercise when I got back and put my group together and said, what are the inventions that have changed everything? Because what we're doing is evaluating an invention. When I say changed everything, I mean, don't give me little things like the wheel or something like that, which, yeah, it's kind of cute. But the fact is, what are inventions that profoundly altered the course of civilization in a way that is still there? In a continuum, I created a continuum which on one level put the classic fad, citizens band radio. At the time, CB radio was a big thing. And warehouses are still stocked with the CB radios that were built from all the companies that went out of business. On the other end, something more permanent, like, let's say, fire. You know, it still works pretty effectively. You know, you can make a good business either making it or putting it out. It's a great thing. And you can say, well, ever since it was discovered, it has been with us. It has had positive and negative impact on our lives, but certainly it's part of everybody's lives on effectively a daily basis and will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. So where is it? Any technology you can put on that scale. It's CB radio, it's fire, or it's somewhere in between. And so we went through every invention we could think of that seemed to be a significant world-changing invention and put it in that context. Let me just open it up to the room. What's the first invention any of you can think of that you thought fundamentally changed the world? Yeah. Printing press, good one, but go earlier. Writing, good one, go earlier. Speech, language. Great. Language is where we sort of started out. Because basically we were kind of herd animals and we were kind of kicking around. And what speech turned into language was the first set of internet protocols for humans. It was the interoperability standard that allowed people who didn't grow up together to be able to communicate with each other. If we grew up together, we would have evolved a method of speaking, but we couldn't talk to those two who grew up together over there. A standardized language basically said up, down, sky, a bunch of other things, which meant within the people who learned our standardized language, we could interoperate, which is the necessary component for being able to start a civilization and move things forward. Took a long time to happen. How much of it's evolution, how much of it's cultural, how much of beats me, talk to someone smart here. But the fact is, it was clearly a big one. Who said writing? Interesting, long gap between language and writing. And writing was one of those staggeringly important inventions which made ideas permanent beyond the lives of their authors without needing verbal storytelling as a way to pass it on. So it was the idea of making ideas portable without having to have the people who authored them or their disciples portable. Terribly powerful. Took a whole bunch of different forms, and ultimately, if you look at those kind of, it's just like evolution is not linear. The progress of society with regards to the impact of technology is not linear. It's step function. Something is invented, takes a while to pick up, has a huge effect, something else does it, and you look at it, it's very uneven. Just as evolution is. People sort of look at evolution as if, well, it was just this slow continuous. No, it wasn't. It was boom, boom. You see a whole bunch of explosions that happened that, for one set of reasons or another, which some we understand and some we don't, caused a whole bunch of stuff to happen all at one sense, became autocatalytic in effect. Who said printing press? Yes, printing press. Who invented the printing press? Gutenberg. No, Gutenberg invented movable precision metal type. He's credited often by inventing the printing press because he was white and male and European. And if you want to be remembered for inventing something, it helps to be white and male and European. But clearly the Chinese, by a few hundred years, predated it. They used wood movable type. People said, oh, well, that didn't count because it was a bunch of pictures and so forth. In fact, the whole written language is based upon pictograms. What of that? But the fact is, we remember Gutenberg, and it's interesting to look at Gutenberg. He died penniless. He ran a failing publishing company. He came up with what he believed to be the killer app. You know, probably the first big killer app. And, you know, you think about it, it was sort of, there was the printing press, there was the, let's see, probably Mist, and we're waiting for the third killer app, you know. But the killer app was the Bible. We can use this thing called movable type, I can lower my costs, get the quality up, and so forth. Died penniless. Why? Gutenberg Bible in today's dollars cost about $80,000. Nobody could read. Those things alone narrowed the market quite a bit. Had a lot of union problems. I mean, the monks doing the illumination said this is the work of the devil, it'll never catch on, the quality isn't as good, et cetera, et cetera. You know, a whole bunch of things that sort of, you know, move forward. Suffice to say, it changed the world, but it took a while and it didn't do Gutenberg any good. What's another one? Move forward in time. Huge invention. Telegraph. I would argue that yes, but probably what followed the telephone had greater impact. Because the telegraph was more a B2B kind of function where, you know, Western Union would do something or do like that. But the telephone meant you directly without an intermediate at much wider bandwidth and lower cost can do it. Who invented the telephone? No. Bell got the patent. Elijah Gray did actually more of the foundation work, filed somewhere between 2 days and 2 weeks late, so the patent was awarded to Bell. Just goes to show you being on time to the patent office does matter. Most valuable patent in the history of the world so far. And what was he about? Trying to revolutionize interoperability between people, which is what it did? No, he was trying to help the hard of hearing and was funded by an Institute for the Hard of Hearing, handicapped to do that. He basically invented the single most alienating technology to the hard of hearing ever. Why? Because prior to that, almost all business and interaction and commerce was done either face-to-face or by the post, you know, written letters and all. It switched almost overnight to the telephone, which became the tool and instrument of business, and the only people who couldn't participate are people who couldn't hear or people who couldn't speak, of which this technology turned out to be. Like I say, probably the single most damaging thing of disenfranchising them as effective and productive members of society. Go figure. Move forward in time. Pick another one. Television. What preceded television? Same ilk. Radio. Yeah, I would put that because television was certainly big, but radio was dramatic. Meaning television was kind of like radio with pictures. But radio was revolutionary. And a lot of your parents or parents' parents had their lives transformed, whether it's through times of war or other things, by the radio. It brought a world into their home that they had no other contact and access to. Fundamentally important. Watch that whole trajectory. Who invented radio? Yeah, Tesla. Tesla thought it was about communicating power or information. In fact, remote control torpedoes was his first project of doing other things. Marconi invented radio, and that was not even that important because his was point to point. It was not until you had people who invented broadcasting, like the Sarnoffs of the world, that it had impact on you. Because it was like telegraph versus the telephone. Radio was talking to ships at sea and doing other things like that. When all of a sudden it became broadcasting, the idea of asymmetry, a big transmitter and a little one, it was important. Tesla, his work predated it. Genius, just beginning to be recognized. One of the things interesting was, again, a defense application, steering a torpedo. How do you move it here? Navy embraced radio steerable torpedoes. Turned out to be a problem, because in the first examples of electronic warfare, they found that if the enemy got a bigger transmitter, listened to what frequency you were on, that they could jam your signal, and if they were really clever, they might be able to turn the torpedo around and send it back to you. This created the first need for information security, privacy, encryption, other things like that. The first technique that was invented to solve that problem is a form of spread spectrum called frequency hopping, where you basically said, by some random predetermined pattern, I'm going to jump around a variety of radio channels synchronously on the thing that's receiving the torpedo and the transmitter. So if you, the enemy, wishing to take over my torpedo, doesn't know what channel to be on, they would only have control for the one moment in time that you're on that frequency. Interestingly enough, do you know who the inventor was of frequency hopping?
Woman.
Yes, a woman, Hedy Lamarr, the actress. Why? Turns out she was a very bright lady. She was married to a torpedo builder, so she had some knowledge of the field of art. The concept of frequency hopping was instituted with 88 frequencies originally because her collaborative inventor was a pianist, and they used piano rolls with 88 keys and 88 frequencies, and they stepped between it, so she's the inventor of that. Often, it's not obvious who invents things that are big ideas, and that's a big idea that's in use today. Every military communication system uses frequency hopping as one form of making a signal agile and hard to jam. And, I mean, not obvious. Why is there no Nobel Prize in mathematics? Well, the story I heard, it's because Nobel's wife ran off with a mathematician, and he decreed there will never be a prize in mathematics. I think that's true, actually. Even if it's not, I like telling it. But I digress. Back to this issue. You go through things, you take the computer, you go through an endless list of computers. Again, you look at it, Thomas Watson, famous quote, what's the total world market for computers? 5 or 6. You know, that was the vision of the leading computer builder at the time, and so forth. Turned out it was understated by somewhat. We added all of these things up. The list you just came up with, well as our list for things, and we found a very interesting set of correlations. One, the inventors were generally clueless about the importance of their invention. Almost always. It was not that. 2, there was no market demand for it. Like you talk about electric light. There was no demand for electric light. Cities worked just fine. There were gas mantles. The whole city was pumped for glass. The argument is you have an installed infrastructure. You're not going to change that. Electricity is dangerous. It can leak out all over the place uncontrollably. That's why, you know, wall switches were made to look like gas taps. Remember those turning ones? It's so that people had a sense of comfort that you're shutting down the electricity before it gets to things. There was no demand for that. There was no demand for the telephone. There was no demand for printing. There was no demand for the automobile. There was no demand for the typewriter. No demand for any of these things. And generally speaking, if you consulted the great people of the time, when the telephone was invented, the New York Times said, this is the most useless, silly, and superfluous invention of all time. That's not a direct quote. But basically they said it has no economic value. I believe that's how they referred to it, the invention of the telephone, when it was announced. So the inventors were clueless. Not only did they have no idea of what it was good for, the public had no idea of what it was good for. But the other thing which emerged that for me was a striking correlation is that every time a fundamentally important storytelling technology was designed, it changed the course of civilization and it was largely permanent. And by storytelling, I mean something that lowers the barriers to storytelling, makes it more accessible, makes the language work, gives you better reach at a lower cost. And it doesn't matter if it was movable type, turning into newspapers in the printing press. Didn't matter if it was radio and television. It didn't. You go down your list. Anytime one of those, which are all storytelling. What do you think movable type is? It's a storytelling technology. It helps you sell a story to one or more. Every time it survived. And you're saying, well, what do you mean? The wax cylinder didn't survive. Wax cylinder was not the invention. Wax cylinder was just the technical implementation. The invention was making music and voice portable. It was the ability to record it. So it went from wax cylinder to, disc, to LP, to 8-track, to compact disc, to net and web delivery. It's all the same invention. It's just a different technological implementation. The invention was the idea of making music portable, sound portable. Still exists today, going strong, nothing in sight that's there. By that criteria, if your core is storytelling, which I maintained was the Walt Disney core business, or storytelling business, we'll tell you a story, we'll give you a place to stay between stories, we'll sell you a lunchbox with Pocahontas on it to remind you of the story, we'll do a whole bunch of things, but storytelling is the core competency, then the internet has to be the most important technology for us ever. And I've commented in the past, and I still believe it, that it's the most important invention since language. More important than writing. The internet will survive writing. Writing's a fad. Give it another 250 years, gone. Be replaced by something better. The fact is, I don't believe there's anything in the human genome that said you're going to do writing. I just believe that it's a way that we found to make the ideas permanent, and as soon as a better idea comes along, it will be an interesting curiosity, just as Latin is now. And I'm sure there are 7 people in this world that are passionate about the fact that Latin is not an interesting curiosity, and the rest of you think those people curious. So the question becomes, what will replace it and how? I don't know. But as I say, I refuse to believe that, reading from left to right or from right to left or from up to down, some series of symbols and all is something the brain was wired to do. I believe we learn to do it, and I believe we can learn to do it well, and I think it's likely we can do things more. Right now, if you did printing, you could change the color of the font based upon the emotion of what you're saying. You could change the weighting, you could change the kerning, you could change a whole bunch of things, use them as dynamics of expression the way punctuation was used years ago. Again, it's just someone to have the imagination to do it and to have an enabling infrastructure which allows you to do it. By that set of metrics, I believe that the fundamental concept of the internet will be the most important storytelling technology ever developed. Why? It will deliver your story at the lowest possible cost to the widest number of people. And I think that that is a fundamentally critical and brand new enabling idea. I think that when you start looking around at where these impacts are going to be, other impacts, the idea of a personal computer, the idea of sustainable buildings, all of that, all great, but nowhere near the importance of that. Because storytelling is the core competency of entertainment, it's the core competency of education, it's the core competency of leadership, whether military or political. I guarantee you, none of you got here because a teacher impressed you with how smart they are. You got here because a teacher in a subject inspired you. And you said, I want to grow up to be like that person. This really fascinates me. It's because they set an autocatalytic process happening inside your brain that took over and made your natural passions want to embrace it. That's storytelling. And that's the art of storytelling. The science of storytelling will be the internet. Simple as that. Now, does that mean we won't have authors, we won't have books, we won't have other things like that? We're going to have a whole variety of those things, but the fact is they're ultimately going to be curiosities, just as the wax cylinder was a curiosity, and just, books had a good run. There's no technology that's threatening it at the moment, but as soon as you have electronic paper, as soon as you have something like this that feels good, looks good, is clear, works in any light, you can pass it around, you can fold it, but by the way, the text just changes on it. Why not? I mean, again, are you in love with the paper? Well, you may, because there is actually something about physical beings in their physical world and the relationship between joyful objects, such as a book can be, or a well-degrined salt shaker, or a piece of art and such. But who's to say that at this moment in time, our concept of art and joyful objects defines it for the rest of eternity? Unlikely. Experimental evidence suggests that there will be a continuous collection of joyful objects that will serve those basic human needs in people's lives. I think that, for me, that was the basis of why I told Michael it's the future of the company and we need to bet the farm on it. Didn't quite get him to do it, but it's certainly a critical part of the company now, and the country. And it's going to affect every profession in such a fundamental way that I think it's, you ignore it at your peril, personally and professionally, and in thinking about policies that redirect the course of civilization, it's important to remember that This technology is very different than any of the other ones you've seen. And when it comes time to regulate it, you say, we got to get rid of spam, we have to regulate it and all. Be very careful, because it's very hard to know what you're messing with when you're doing that. And I hate spam, as do all of you. And it's an assault, and it's an affront, and I don't want kids looking at porn that's emailed to them for no reason and all. But all of those same issues we had to deal with in every other form of publication that took on. I mean, keep in mind, the videotape business was driven by porn. It was not driven by standard home video. It was not driven by Disney. It was driven by porn, as was softback publishing, as was a whole variety of other things. None of you in this room would partake in that, but someone out there thinks porn is actually useful in their life, and therefore there's a whole industry which delivers it. That industry is going to embrace the best storytelling technology and medium, just as everybody else is they're in the storytelling business for reasons of commerce or for reasons of other things that I don't understand. But that's why there's so much activity there. And incidentally, the amount of traffic of spam and porn on the internet far outweighs all of the other traffic. I mean, it's like 80% of total traffic volume when you start looking at the amount of bits moving. So, big set of issues. But how do you regulate it? How do you change it? It's sort of like saying, how do you regulate freedom of speech? You have to be kind of careful with that, as is witnessed by experiments in other places in the world, as well as experiments that have failed or been tested within our court system. So you have to approach with caution. It's not an easy thing. I'm just about out of time, so what I want to do is talk about your big six. The things I was thinking about earlier today, before I came over last night, and sort of tempered with what you're doing. Here are the 6 things that within the context of our conversation and what you said, you have to get right. You have to get it right for yourselves professionally. You have to get it right for our nation, for our kids, and for our future, or we're going to fail. The first one is vision. It's not a word that's popular to talk about much these days, and I don't mean a mission statement, and I don't mean, some set of slogans that look good on something, but I mean true vision. By vision, something that will inspire the next generation of kids to want to spend their life doing this. Vision that will inspire people within your organizations to be able to move mountains and exceed the performance that they themselves thought they were capable of, let alone what anyone else thought they were capable of. The concept of vision can be translated into a whole lot of different things. We were talking about the military earlier. This whole concept of effects-based warfare is about saying, rather than what's a process we go through to win, quote unquote, it's about saying what's the end effect you want to produce. Might or might not be winning. Might be getting people not to fight. Might be a whole bunch of other things. And then therefore, what's the process you go to do that? The fashionable word these days is transformation. Until we get to effects-based transformation and realizing that unlike effects-based warfare, effects-based transformation is not an endpoint. And I think people get it wrong. The notion is, well, we're done transforming. Let's get on to the next, transformation later. Maybe horizontal integration would be good. So you got to get this concept of vision and understanding that it's not an option within organizations. It is essential, and that it's the easiest thing to overlook and forget. Why? Because most well-designed organizations run fine on autopilot without vision. Now, do they survive for a long time? They can design for a fair amount of time. It's sort of like telling you want a super tanker to do a U-turn. Just turn the power off. It'll go for 30 or 40 miles. You have to go to full reverse power to stop it in 20 miles. A lot of inertia. A lot of inertia in big organizations, in government, in corporations, in institutions. The question is, what do you do to provide the path forward? After vision, and a thing that we're in great jeopardy of in this country at the moment, is trust. And we have a crisis of trust. People don't trust their government. They don't trust their leadership. They don't trust what they hear on television. They trust more what they hear from a mystic reading their palm than what they hear from a scientist. And that tells you something both about mystics and about scientists and about the state of trust. If we do not get this under control, it's going to have a staggeringly negative long-term impact. Because ultimately, if you don't have an underlying concept of trust, and again, public trust, external trust to your organization, more so internal trust, that the people within the organization trust that the vision is something that's worth spending your life doing, you're never going to be better than mediocre. And this nation's never going to be better than mediocre if it doesn't recover and also realize that other people's ideas matter too. It's very easy in a superpower, the superpower, to be sufficiently insular. I mean, most Americans not only don't care about what's happening in Europe or what's happening in the Middle East or somewhere else, they don't care about what's happening in Canada. I mean, they don't care about what's happening in Montana. Their sense is the world that they're living with provides a very nice encapsulation, and they're worried about that. We have to broaden the dialogue and discussion such that the context of trust beyond that. I go to Europe a lot, and I have never seen the amount of anti-Americanism as there is now, where basically every conversation you're asked to defend your country. Well, I'm proud to defend my country, but the way I'm going to defend my country in a local conversation when I'm in London is not effective in the long term and is not a substitute for a foreign policy, but beyond that, a foreign sensibility which gives one a foundation and a basis for global trust. Because if history means anything, and again, the thing about Ferren's law that always strikes me as being useful to remember is that if you believe that people do not follow Moore's law and that the sensibilities, likes, dislikes, and values are largely constant, then the best tool you have is history for predicting the future. You may need other metrics like Moore's law for predicting the impact of computing power, but not for the impact of social dynamics between enterprises or elements of civilization. The next one is talent. We are turning into a third world country from the perspective of the talent pool available. When you look at combined science and math scores and other things like that, it's shocking. That is not sustainable in the long term. If you have a boring, painful organization, which everybody hates, and when you walk into the organization makes you feel bad, you're not going to attract the best talent. They're going to go to Procter & Gamble, they're going to go to the Navy, they're going to go to the state senate, they're going to open a hot dog stand, but they're not going to go with you. Doesn't matter how good your vision is, if you don't have the ability, well, it actually does matter. If you don't have a great vision, you have no prayer of attracting top talent. If you do, it's still difficult, and you have to realize, just as our discussion earlier about big ideas versus requirements, if you decide that you need big idea people as being part of your enterprise, and you don't create an environment capable of sustaining them, you're doomed, because they're going to leave. They're going to say, enough of this stuff. I'm not wanted here. I'm not loved. I'm not rewarded appropriately. Remember, you get the behavior you reward, not what you ask for. The fact you say, we are a creator-friendly environment doesn't mean anything if what you're doing is rewarding the people who are behaving badly. Badly meaning against your model that you're putting forth. This concept of talent, attracting it, keep in mind, what it takes to attract the next generation of talent is not what it took to attract you. Kids are different. The generation of kids being born today, if you showed them an LP record, wouldn't understand what it is, what it's used for, or how to use it. Because by the time they grow up, all music is going to be delivered over the web and stored solid state locally to where they are. And at some point, as a great curiosity, people will discover these things called record players. Remember, they were Victrolas when you were, a kid and such. But, again, it changes. They think about the world differently. A kid growing up today, connected on the web, part of a community with 14 IM windows, open at the same time, talking to their kids. When Internet Messenger started, within the first year, it had a traffic by a certain validated metric of 1.5 billion messages per day. This is 1 year after it started. That is the fastest adoption of any communications technology in history. The number of people embracing it and using it. How many of you are on IM? Okay. The rest of you are clueless about the dynamics of what's going on. Your kids aren't. And in fact, those of you who raised your hand, you're still old farts. I mean, you're still looking at it from kind of an, oh, that's kind of cute. But you're not living it. You're not part of a community that's connected and distributed that's never known anything else. That's the way you talk. It's the way that you communicate. It's the way you do this. Nuance, expression, do you capitalize, do you not? What do you put together? You don't understand that language. You may get a few little bits and pieces of it, but you don't understand what it is to live it any more than the typical American who hasn't lived in the Middle East, and I speak with some minor authority. When I was a kid, I lived in the Middle East for a year, hasn't got a clue about what's going on over there. Now, I don't have a clue about what's going on about there, but the sensibility I got from living there as a little kid in 1962 and going to the American Community School is very different than most of my friends and other folks, because you get a sense that there's something going on here which is a lot bigger than anyone else understands, and that the idea that you're simply going to make nice and kiss someone on the cheek and these problems are going to go away, yeah, right. Not that class of problem. But you wouldn't know that unless you experience it. That's going to be experienced by the next generation of kids without going there. And it's going to be experienced either to our benefit or our detriment, depending upon what community they end up being part of. And you, as the parents, don't know what that is most of the time because you don't speak the language and aren't paying attention to the dynamic. Next thing, number 4 on your big 6, or big 7, as this goes on, is complexity. The world is too complex to understand anymore. Your computer is too complex. No one in this room knows how their computer works. And if you know how your computer works, you don't understand how the operating system works. And if you know that, you don't understand the network management. If you know that, you don't understand the router tables, at the school that it's connected to. Why? The complexity of this technology has outpaced anyone's ability to understand other than at a high level. And again, if you understand this, there's another element. And it's the same all around us. One could argue it's the same in geopolitics. One could argue that it's the same in interrelationships between people in society who have had jobs displaced and are attempting to re-educate themselves in an environment where nobody even knows what that means, let alone when you're 52 years old, what do you mean, re-educate myself? I was as good as anyone got in my business. The business just doesn't happen to exist anymore. So this concept of complexity, it has a few implications. One, if you think you're going to have all the information you need to make an intelligent decision, get over it. You're wrong. Those days are over. And a lot of the things that are going to be critical decisions for the United States to make, education, jobs, do we go to war, do we not, is there WMD, are there, any of those sorts of things. Face it, you're not going to have the facts. You're going to have to make a decision before the package is put forth in front of you that's coherent and makes sense. So you're going to have to develop some other set of tools of being able to effectively operate in an environment where the traditional notion of modeling, simulation, look at it, do analytics, doesn't apply anymore. And this is going to keep accelerating. The Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. It's not only change that's accelerating, but the rate of change is accelerating. And there's nothing that's going to slow this down or stop it. And so the things that seem confusing or disorienting or such, get used to it and develop a set of tools that let you function with that environment. Next thing, I wish I had a cute name for this. I called it the viscosity of knowledge, meaning how long does it take ideas, real ideas, to flow, whether it's in an organization, like someone calls up with a product complaint because something has failed. How long does that take to get to the designers of the product? Does it ever get to them? Someone calls up because they see an airplane flying overhead that's heading in the wrong direction and looks like it might hit the World Trade Center. How long does it take for that information to get somewhere? How long does it take to take 3 or 4 or 30 or 40,000 or 30 or 40 million bits of information and put them together in a way that they can be correlated to make some sense of it? How can you go from information to knowledge? Only system capable of doing that I've seen is a brain. So how do you provide an environment which allows brains to be able to get a view of these highly complex and scaling in complexity by the minute issues so that you can make a thoughtful decision? Often a life and death decision, often not. Often it's just, hey, what stock do I buy? This is a huge challenge. If the information flows too quickly, you make mistakes because there isn't enough analytics and thoughtfulness behind it. If it doesn't flow quickly enough, you basically say, how come nobody told me? Or if I had known this when I made this decision, I wouldn't have made it. The organization says, well, we didn't think it was important. Right, because they didn't have the context to understand why it's important. And getting context to flow down through an organization as information percolates up into a knowledge is the single biggest communications challenge, in my opinion, facing any enterprise today. And it is not keeping pace with the increase in the flow of information. Some of this has to do with communication skills. It's why I advocate banning PowerPoint, because verbal communications, waving your hands, drawing something on the wall, you develop a set of skills of what it takes to compel people and get your point across and make an idea. The deck slid across the table does not do that. And in fact, what it does is obscure truth, it obscures passion, it obscures all of the values that, as I was talking about earlier, the difference between the art and war and the science of technology of war, it obscures the things that are a critical part of human decision making. And it is to our peril that we don't deal with this. And I'm only half joking when I talk about what's wrong with PowerPoint. I mean, I'm not singling out PowerPoint. I can give you a dozen other examples. In government, especially in the Department of Defense and intelligence community, you cannot talk without PowerPoint. And the idea that someone would actually speak to someone is considered inappropriate, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not exaggerating. And I wish it were limited to DOD. You go to half the corporations in America, and the discussion starts with the deck rather than an idea or a vision. There's a final one. And incidentally, let me just back up on that one, because the biggest change when we talk about geopolitics since the Cold War, from my perspective, is we no longer know who our enemies are. That's a big change. We used to know who the enemies were. We built the Cold War around knowing who an enemy was. Whether they were or not is a separate discussion. The fact is, it worked, it was a model, it functioned, everyone could build something to work against it. That's changed. This will be useful at the trial. In a world where uncertainty dominates the equation, knowing who your enemy is, knowing how you're going to function, you've got a big problem if you have a system that is based upon a rigid decision-making process, which is largely what we have now, and based upon a series of fixed metrics that have to be quantitative to be expressed and evaluated. The final thing I'd like to talk about, and this is like the final thought I'd like to leave you with, is there's one thing, those other 5 things I talked about, you know, they're important. I really hope some of you take it seriously, because if you don't, our country is in trouble and our world is in trouble. But there's a bigger one. And in this country, it's a bigger problem than health and health care. It's a bigger problem than poverty. It's a bigger problem than crime. It's a bigger problem than war. It's a bigger problem than terrorism. It's called education. And everyone in this room should be embarrassed when you wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and realize we've allowed our country to become a third world country from the perspective of educating our kids. Someone know what the math and science scores are? Yeah. Yeah. Right, and remember Latvia brought us the Kurta calculator. No, but anyway, they did actually. Remember the Kurtis? So the thing which is appalling about this is I see no process that looks like it's setting this back on track except one. And that one goes back to what I was talking about in storytelling, and that is the internet. Now, I'm not talking about the internet and bringing computers into schools. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people that think basically we can replace teachers with computers, a lot cheaper, easier to do. To believe that means you either don't know what a computer does or don't know what a teacher does, or both. However, the most sophisticated technology I've seen in an inner city school, and I visit a lot of them, are the metal detectors that frisk kids for weapons before they go into the schoolroom. This is not a joke. This is a big problem. And all of these other problems, talent, trust, leadership, you know, all of that complexity, how do you think you're going to deal with that with a nation and a world of dummies? How do you think you're going to begin to deal with these constructs? How do you think you're going to deal with educating a populace so that they can have a voice in a democratic society about issues that they can't begin to understand because they don't have the background to understand it? One approach is to say, well, an elitist approach. We will decide. Forget this whole democracy thing. We'll put someone in charge. We'll just worry about it and we'll go from there. That doesn't work so hot. We have a fair amount of evidence to suggest that. What also doesn't work so well is when you have notions of, shall we extend life infinitely, and at what cost? Shall we enable implants? Shall we track everybody? Shall we understand your identity every time you walk by a street corner? We're going to recognize you, know where you are, keep a track of that, and so forth, because we need it to look at terrorists, et cetera. A whole bunch of technologies that are all within our grasp that are not problematic from a technology perspective. They may or may not be problematic from a cost perspective, but we're a very rich country. We can afford to do a lot of problematic things that people in the rest of the world can't. But the question of the social implications of these and understanding what these are, you cannot have an intelligent discourse on this without a public sufficiently educated to be able to grasp the underlying concepts, and without a sufficient passion for education to wish to grasp these fundamental concepts. This is a big, big issue. The good news is, what's the good news in this? is this concept of the web, and by that I mean ubiquitous network computing, where devices are connected and interconnected together. The electronic book, for lack of a better description, is the future. Why? Because if you believe that what all of this is about and having a stimulating and educated public discourse necessary to come to the right decisions is about education, it is a window on truth, and it is a window on other people's visions, and it's a window on knowledge. If you imagine an electronic book, 10, 20 years, it'll cost the same amount as a regular book to make. Solar powered, wireless by satellite, works anywhere on the earth, just as well, in Harvard Square as it is in the middle of South Africa. Speaks in any language. And when I say speaks, I mean speaks. You don't have to know to read or write. It's just you have to speak some recognizable dialect. This will talk to you. It'll listen to you and translate back. It'll speak graphically if that's better for you. It'll speak any other form. And it has access to all of the knowledge in the world, which ends up stored in connected subsystems on the web, which will be all the knowledge of the world for all intents and purposes, because that's where it's heading. Certainly all of recorded history, and certainly all of future history. There's a little gray area in between, which may have been lost and not captured, and without the storytelling tradition may disappear. But most of it's there. It's actually early digital media that'll disappear, because analog media tends to last a very long time and you can recover it. Digital media, you go find some of the 8-inch floppies you had with your thesis on it, and you try to read it somewhere. And if you can read it now, try it in 10 years and try it in 20 years. That information is gone forever. And having seen some of your theses, this is not a bad thing. But nonetheless, other than the gray area of the dawn of digital civilization, it's all here and it's all going to be here. And I guess my argument is that this miracle of the wireless PDA and all of that is going to be the salvation of our kids. It's going to be the fundamental underpinnings that builds interconnected communities who care enough about the human condition of others all over the place because they're connected to them. They will not take so lightly decisions that might disrupt that balance. That ultimately it will be the thing that I think this country has survived as effectively and become as successful as it has because of, and that's truth. We are at our worst when truth is non-obvious. We are at our best when truth is out there, whether the truth is good news or bad news or something we screwed up or something we got right. Truth, I will bet on. If I had to depend upon the future of democracies and of this democracy in particular, I would base it on truth. Getting truth out there, letting other people make up their minds. I mean, it's disturbing when you hear the little kids in Afghanistan reciting from the Quran. Remember that footage from a year or so ago? Realizing that most of them don't speak Arabic, and this is just rote. I mean, they don't even know what they're saying. In their vision of us are people there that are there to hurt and kill them. And we're proving that that's correct from their perspective, meaning the only visibility they've seen to us is something came over, some things blew up. Do you think they have a context for anything else? The whys, the wheres, the wherefores? No. So all we're doing in our effort to do what we think is right, and what some significant percentage of people think is right, are causing another significant percentage of people confusion and to think that we are the enemy. I would argue that if you put truth in front of them, I would suggest for a change, as we get electronic books, why don't we start dropping them on people rather than leaflets? Drop windows to truth and drop windows to knowledge and information on people. And there are ways to do that metaphorically as well as physically. And I think ultimately that is the underpinning of how the internet, the net, and these emerging technologies will in fact be responsible if you, the people in this room, choose to embrace them personally and specifically to address the issues of education, to address the issues of the transformation of democracy, and to address the issues of identifying the next generation of leadership in the United States. And I think I've talked too much, so thank you for listening.
We arranged this till 3, so there is time for a few questions. If you're going to ask a question, please grab your mic and let's have it. Just raise your hand if you have a question. What?
Larry Lessig was on campus yesterday, and one thing
Technology.
When you were talking about your electronic book idea, of course this is
Not mine.
not yours, but the idea of electronic books, of course that assumes that the information will be accessible to people without paying for it. And so, where do you stand on this whole copyright, legal, intellectual property rights situation?
Well, I think intellectual property rights are essential, or you won't have people who are authors, by and large. Because if you want to earn a living doing it, it's useful to have some mechanism to achieve that. Or else we're going to have hobbyist authorists, or we're going to have just rich authors. And so I think that it's an important set of issues. I think it's not well understood within the implications of the electronic age. I think the idea of rigid copyright rules and terms of use that were appropriate within the original connected world, when connection meant printing books and leaflets and other things like that, ought to be different in the electronic age. There have been proposals, microcache, 1/1,000,000th of a cent per word for anything someone reads, make it affordable. Can be tiered. If it's in this country, this area, or you have red hair, or you're living in a blue house, it's free. To everybody else, it's $5 million. You get to set the rules. The author gets to determine it. Terms of copyright. Redefinition of fair use. If it's for your own use versus it's for someone else, et cetera, et cetera. I think there will be a lively debate about this for the foreseeable future. I offhand don't see that it's a huge obstacle. The huge obstacle would be if information were not getting to people in a way that they can use it. That I don't see as largely being the problem. For the same reason that if you can't afford a book, you can go to a public library, often. There are an awful lot of things that are out there on the web that accomplish the same function, including library outreach and a bunch of other things. I think the question of economics tends to enter into it when the question is, does a third party profit from reuse of your stuff without your permission? That, I think, is something that's not such a hot idea. Because I think in the long run, it means that sustaining the industries such as publishing businesses and other things, what's a publisher do? Identifies the good stuff for you. I mean, remember at the beginning, everyone said on the web, well, everything will be out there, and so it's just as easy for me to publish to 10 billion people as it is for anyone else. And the answer is yes, but who cares? And with function publishers were to pick the people you might want to care about and put it in front of you so that if you went to this particular publisher and looked at their next book from this author, it's probably worth your attention enough to say, well, they might be serious because of that publisher's reputation for selecting talent in this given area. I see nothing that makes that model go away. And so I think you'll see basically just a transposition to the electronic medium. By definition, traditional copyright for things like music copying and other things is impossible. Meaning, if you wish to defraud, just as it was impossible since the Xerox was invented. When a copier machine was invented, it meant maintaining copyright such that a person cannot duplicate this cost effectively ceased to be a viable option. Meaning, originally you could print on red paper because the original copiers were insensitive to red, being orthochromatic, so if you copied it black on red, it couldn't be copied. Great, we got over that. Now you can copy anything. So, technical solutions that simply prevent people from doing something are never a good solution. They may be an intermediate solution that makes sense to companies, because the question is not making it impossible, it's making it hard enough so that it's not worth someone's while to do it. But I think the world will adjust and adapt and equalize around it. And I say I don't find this the problem that a lot of people do. It's certainly a problem if you're in the publishing business. It's a problem if you're in the entertainment business. It's a problem if you author certain types of things. But it doesn't strike me as by being insurmountable by any way.
I see a similar problem with PowerPoint and the internet. How do you feel about the obvious diminishment of human contact that involves? It doesn't seem to bother you.
That's right.
Did you get that?
Yes, and many other things. It bothers me a great deal, but who cares? What I mean by that is as follows. Most literature is junk. I mean, it's not like every book that published is a great gem. Just go to a typical used bookstore and look around and see what it takes to find something you love, unless it's a very selective used bookstore. Paperbacks, a bunch of other things, pulp. there's always going to be a lot of random noise in human discourse. And the more free and open and cheap you make it, the more there is, which is why tools that allow you to get to the stuff you want become increasingly more important. Right now, you could live on the internet and never have anything other than the New York Times, have the joke of the week, and have email from the only 5 people you like that you wish to receive email from. You could set the internet up to be that. Never see anything else, never hear anything else. You can also open the floodgates and have it be everything and be inundated with spam and news and emailings and sign up on every list, and you'll get 10,000 things per day, none of which you care about. It's a lot like society. You can go out in the streets, and depending upon what neighborhood you walk into, you can be barraged by sound, by images, by other forms. Television, most television is pretty embarrassing in the whole scheme of things, although there's some great stuff on television. I grew up on television. My parents said it would rot your brain. They were probably right, but I like television. I learned probably more about the world from television, for better or for worse, than I did in school. So I think and kids now are learning more about the world from the internet than they are in school or on television, because they're spending more time on the web than the rest of it. I find it distressing when I have a young person talking to me and they don't capitalize things and they don't do this, because even though I hated doing all of that stuff, and grammar was never my favorite thing, as should be self-evident from this speech, the fact is you survive it. And the fact is that the affront to the sensibilities of older people isn't the same affront to the sensibilities of younger people, and the younger people will self-regulate by what they choose to use, reject, and accept, what works best for them. Now, for the same reason that it's useful when a civilization decides we're going to subsidize the arts, and in fact we're going to subsidize unpopular arts because we think it's important for people to be exposed to this and learn this. Often triggers controversy, waste, fraud, and abuse and such, but it's important. And that, should we go to the moon? Should we go to Mars? Should we do other things? Well, you can have 2 points of view. We have higher priorities, and we should take that $16 billion and put it into other stuff. At which point the other notion is, well, there's no higher aspiration than us leaving this planet and going out into the stars and discovering where we came from and how, and being part of the ultimate exploration. In between the sort of the actuarial view of it, which is saying, well, that $16 billion is largely going into paying the salaries of people and products that are being made that go into a space program, so what do we do with all of those unemployed people when we shut down NASA? A lot of different dimensions of ways to look at this. But I think the quality of the dialogue versus the volume of the dialogue, yeah, it's like looking for needles in a haystack. Sometimes it's even harder. It's looking for hay in a haystack, a specific type of hay. But the fact that the volume is going up, yes, in aggregate, the percentage of good stuff may very well be going down. For instance, publishing, that's the case. The number of things that are published, the quality is down, because you don't have the selection filter of the hurdles that people have to get over to get published. At the same time, I see no evidence that the absolute quantity of good stuff is going down. In fact, I think it tends to be the opposite. And I think the larger effect of having access to the knowledge of the world as represented by the participants in the web so outweighs the negatives that it's worth navigating through.
One last question.
I just retired last summer from 24 years of teaching in public schools in Brooklyn, and I was very interested to hear you keeping up education as the biggest problem, and the internet as a way of hopefully solving it, because in that time I didn't see very effective use of the internet in the New York City school system. There was tutoring over the internet, which was a small amount, very good, and some teaching kids to make websites, which was very good, but small scale, so not widely adapted. And between the present and the 10 or 15 years of the electronic book that you're talking about, and you said you visited a lot of inner city schools, what do you see going on now that is the beginning of a path for direction of the electronic book? In other words, how could...
I see kids growing up on high-performance computers at home. It's not happening in schools. It's happening slowly. It's not surprising that it's happening slowly in schools because they're conservative, high-inertia institutions. If we're 15 years into the internet by the new definition of the internet, probably closer to 10. And if you were 15 years into movable type and printing, you would have had all the same observations. Meaning, this is for elitists, it has no function in education, no one can afford books, I don't see people embracing it, and so forth. Absolutely true, but don't expect them to in 10 years, because we're back here on the curve. So, how does it start? It starts because they are becoming computer literate before they get to school. So they're not depending upon the school to teach them about computers or teach them about communities or talking to each other. What's appalling is that, we have programs where schools, for example, businesses get tax breaks by giving schools their old computers. The most stupid idea I have ever heard of in my life. The kids don't need the old computers. The kids need the newest computers. You use the old piece of junk to run your PowerPoint, but give the kids the hot new multimedia-enabled engine which does something, it's the idea of, well, let's give them all the old books. We got old books we're not using here. Let's put them in our schools. Everyone would say, what are you, demented? Yet let's give them the old computers. Great idea, and we get a tax break. So I think that it's not unsurprising that it's taking a long time. I think you will find it's one of those autocatalytic things that once it takes off, it goes like that. And I think it's going to start because the kids starting to show up at school now know more than their teachers do about computers, the internet, and what's out there and how to use it. They also are starting to learn a lot about where the dangers are. I grew up in New York City, and I had a sense of what side of the street to walk on or not, or what neighborhoods I can go in or not, or don't go into the park at night, or if those kids look funny on that corner, cross over to the other side of the street, and if they've got an eye on you, maybe you should go the other direction. Call it street smarts, call it whatever you want. Kids will start developing that about the internet. Now, the problem with the internet is the ability to conceal identity is something which makes identifying a person out to hurt you harder. When I say hurt you, I mean if you're a kid and there's someone out there, a pedophile, etc. Unfortunately, these people have always found ways to hurt people, irrespective, whether it's standing on the schoolyard or whether it's doing something else. So they're going to use the new medium just as other people will. The disturbing element is that the parents are not often making the effort to be literate and stay involved with their kids' interactions in the electronic world. They are in the schoolyard, and if they saw some, funny-looking person come up and talk to their kid, they'd say, wait a minute, come over here. And they would instruct their kids onto what, if this happens, do this. Don't get into the car. If someone says, we're looking for my dog, the course of our nation. And it was very interesting because on one level, you're talking about something that's a pretty qualitative set of things, meaning, the soft and fuzzies of who's going to make a good leader. At the same time, you're dealing with organizations like the Army, which are very highly quantitative. The Army is big on metrics. If it is measurable, they will measure it and write it down in your file. And it doesn't matter if it's your dimensions, it doesn't matter if it's your attitude, it doesn't matter how well you did in an exercise, it doesn't matter if it's a passing comment that happened at some point in your career. It's recorded and used to maintain the cut of your jib from the perspective of your promotional path through the organization. And the same process happens to a less formalistic extent at most enterprises. The Army cares about your inseam. Disney didn't care as much about your inseam, but cared about, are you likely to make the company successful? Are you likely to be able to do the sorts of things necessary to keep the stock price up or move forward in a way that will advance the brand? The Army did a study a number of years ago on how do we find our leaders, where do we get them. One of the good news about being part of a study with an organization like the Army is if you think history is valuable, meaning you want to go back and see that, an organization that writes everything down and doesn't throw it away is kind of useful because you can look at the history. Those Army people, am I speaking truth here? Yes, okay. So they decided to use the scenario planning process. Everyone familiar with scenario planning as a technique? Fine. Anyone who isn't, when I ask something like that, don't be shy to say something, because if most people nod their head yes, I'm not going to explain it. So scenario planning largely says, let me explain it, basically says that what you're doing is effectively picking a couple of axes that you think are fundamental to the success of the organization, such as if you're looking at a product, will it succeed? Cost of goods versus sales volume, etc. Doesn't matter what it is. Different industries pick different things for leadership, for where's their company going. But the purpose of it is to imagine the scenarios of things skew on these axes. And it's represented as, 4 quads. And the idea is basically, if let's say cost of goods higher, cost of goods lower, volume higher, volume lower, it gets you to think about the what ifs. And the assumption is always that where you think you are or where you think you're going is there. So the starting point is, this is what we believe to be reality at the moment. And the exercise I find is actually often a very useful. So at random, would you please holler out who you are and what the hell you're doing here?
I teach communications here, and one of the things I do is story.
Oh, that old thing. I'm fond of referring to it as the world's oldest profession, contrary to popular rumor. Someone else. You.
I'm Suzanne Goldstein. I had the good fortune of meeting Bran about 11 years ago. One of the stories you told back then, this was at a conference, was that the internet was the greatest invention since fire. And I'm curious how you feel about that 10 years later. I'm here at the Community School Women Career Program, having been in technology for the past 15 years, seeing what happens in terms of press sector collaboration.
I'm Greg, and I would love to know your ideas on globalization and leadership and diplomacy.
It's a fad. No, I was kidding.
Center, and I'm very interested in, part of my project here is looking at how technology and the internet transform journalism. How we
Already has.
transform journalism in that ways.
That hasn't happened yet, but the other part's happening. Mm-hmm.
I'm Brad Swing, and I'm interested in high-performance green building technology.
I don't have gain control, but if you'd like, I can stuff a Kleenex over the microphone. Perfect, thank you. Sam, say it again.
I'm interested in high-performance green building technology, whether we can build buildings that power themselves just by their relationship to Earth.
They can, but they have to suck it from somewhere. So the question is, where do you get enough?
I actually graduated.
Shocking.
with my master's in planning. I would like to know the bad.
Yes. Personal computers would be high on my list, but I can get into that later. Anyone else? Anyone else is not represented by this community that just spoke up? Okay. In that case, what I'd like to do also is talk about your big 6. The 6 things, based upon what I'm hearing, that you absolutely, positively have to get right in your life and careers, or you're going to fail, and you may screw up the planet. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This concept of leadership is a really interesting track when you don't have any good information that would enable you to make an intelligent decision. And those are the kind of decisions that you're going to have to make from now on in the future constantly. And it's a set of decisions we as a society have to make, meaning, we were talking about this at lunch. I would argue that within the next 50 to 100 years, death is going to be optional. You get to decide. The society has to decide. Death, you want to die, you want not to die. What are the implications of that? How do you do something about that? When implants become commonplace as intelligence amplifiers of people, when basically, right now, kids terrorize their parents by getting pierced and tattooed. It's the current thing. I mean, when I was a kid, we terrorized them by other means. Your kids or your kids' kids are going to terrorize their parents by going out and getting a net job, basically getting wired. And this is not optional. This is going to happen, period. It's just a matter of time. All the technology foundations are there for it. It's going to happen. So the question is, do we let it happen? Do we have a choice? Is it good? Is it bad? And what can we think about policy-wise now that might affect the trajectory of those kinds of inevitabilities? And one of the issues is, how do you determine what is inevitable? Because inevitability is kind of an interesting concept, where I have watched in my lifetime multiple technologies which people said couldn't work, wouldn't work, such as massively parallel computing architectures, where you basically take tens or hundreds or thousands or millions of little microprocessors and you get them all to work together as if they're one computer. And there are a whole set of laws and arguments about how this will not scale above a certain number of processors. The processing overhead to get them to work together is greater than the gain you get from the processors. Turns out it was a wonderful argument. Scholars and mentors of mine, like Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, wrote a paper, Perceptrons, which explained why neural nets don't work, et cetera, et cetera. The only problem is it's all wrong. And when you have a very persuasive argument from very bright people that's wrong, it often sets back a field by 10 years or so, because none of the grad students will work in it because they will not graduate if they work in it. And it turns out to be a field that they can't make progress in. And so a lot of these phenomena drive things in a way that's not obvious. So I'd like to talk about those kind of things, but I'd really like to talk about whatever you're interested in talking about. I'd like to stop for one moment, and can we just hear from a few people in the room, because it helps me to talk to you if I know what you're interested in and what your background. 1, 2, 3, 4? Right, thanks. We'll talk about oxidation of contacts later. I have no particular plan, no particular subject. I made a whole bunch of notes, because if I don't make notes, I tend to just ramble endlessly. But I usually default to rambling endlessly. So what I'd like to do is talk about whatever you're interested in. It's a pleasure to be here. I have fond memories of this town. Contrary to what it says in my bio, I dropped out of MIT. I didn't graduate MIT. And in fact, I dropped out of courses at Harvard and at Caltech. So I decided to have a well-rounded education, dropping out of some of the finer schools that I could find. But what I want to talk to you about today, I mean, the talk, Leaders, Followers, and Machines, not my title, but it's as good a title as any because it gives me something to think about. And I guess I'm a little concerned that there is so much focus in companies, this nation, and our universities today on getting the correct answers, that we are seldom taking time to be thoughtful about the questions. And so I think what I want to think about is, a little with you today, is what's it take to ask the correct questions? You know, what is that process? How do you know it? Because getting a brilliant answer to the wrong question is seldom useful. And I think you're seeing good examples of that in the press almost every day of the week. And so what's that about? When you start thinking about leadership, what will leadership mean? There are a whole lot of enterprises in government, intelligence and such, which are talking about, I mean, the terms you hear now are transformation, horizontal integration. Basically, it's all saying, we built a machine to do the Cold War. Who knew? The Cold War ended, and now all of a sudden we're trying to repurpose that machine to do something else. Really hard to do. Machines don't repurpose well, whether they're human-populated machines or other types of machines. And so I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to talk about implications of technology. Technology is impacting our lives for better or worse, whether we like it or not. And so the question is, given that kind of environment, what can we do to optimize that in some way that it might in fact be more effective than it would be if you simply stood back and watched what happens? How do you make those calls? Some number of you in this room are going to be put in a position where you're going to be making calls on whether to adopt a technology, pick from one of 7, ignore it, do something else. How do you make that decision? How do you make the decision of focusing the attention, betting the farm on one particular technological one? Because as you sort of careen forward in your career, you start realizing that there is a real challenge of how you get big organizations to function effectively. Little organizations can be as much of a challenge, but big organizations in particular, it's very challenging due to the inertia and scale. And when you're talking about things having to do with public policy, when you're talking about things having to do with defense, you're talking about building codes and institutions and getting people to think green, you're talking about these kinds of interactions, planning, how does it work? You have to get big organizations to change, or basically nothing will happen. And big organizations are intrinsically change resistant. They exist like any other organism because they have a very strong survival instinct, and survival is generally interpreted as don't change anything because this worked and got us here, so therefore let's keep that there. There's an antibody reaction you trigger when you start doing change in organizations. Very effective, tends to kill the change quickly and effectively, or at least isolate it so it can't harm the larger organism. And what do you do about that? More importantly, how do you pick and identify the leaders of tomorrow who are going to be capable of executing these things, creating these visions? And all of you are here for one reason or another because you're candidates for that. You know, you're a self-selected community. You wouldn't be in this room if someone didn't think somewhere that you had the ability to lead, to theorize about leadership, to have impact on the world at large. And many organizations, I mean, in the defense community, a few of the folks that I work with, and I work pretty evenly with folks in government industry, non-government industry, creative industries and such, they've got a really interesting set of challenges, which are lack of flexibility in hiring and firing procedures, which are just set up institutionally. A lot of people who have nothing much to do other than make your life miserable, or that's the perception of leadership, generally speaking. They would often perceive otherwise, but how many of you are in that position and have experienced that phenomena? Trust me, if you work in government, you will decide that is quite correct. University systems are like that too, incidentally, some. You find yourself in a situation where the question of selecting, how do you pick someone early in their career, nurture them, get them to the stage so they're prepared to be the next leader. If you get this wrong, for instance, if the Army gets this wrong, we could lose the next war, or we could start the next war, or we could do some combination of things that could be catastrophic by any number of metrics to the